But when I have got somebody on a craft and they're looking around, they're telling me they're seeing one or two beings, one of the questions that I will ask is that when you look at the beings, is there any of them that look familiar to you? And they'll go, yes, this one to my right, which is interesting because if they're familiar, it means they've seen them before. Mm-hmm. Okay, and that's the intent behind it. I want you to ask the being how many times they've picked you up, and they'll reel off 2, 5, 7, 20, whatever it is. They'll just reel it off because they connect to it and they can bring in the information, and that can blow them away because they have no memory or no recall up to that moment that their subconscious is actually giving them the information.
Welcome back. I'm here with Mary Rodwell. Mary, welcome.
Thank you very much, Sean. It's a pleasure to meet you.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to have you on the show. And this is the first time you've been on. So I want to learn more about your background. How did you get into this whole genre of activity? Because it's a far cry from where you started, is what I understand. So just tell the audience briefly about your background and how you became interested in kind of the metaphysical, life beyond the physical.
Well, the weird and wonderful world of the paranormal, as they call it, the extraordinary experience. Well, I would never have said when I was a nurse and then a midwife that one day I'd be traveling the world talking about these kind of things. But what I will say is that I've always been interested in, the hidden truths, if you like, of our planet. Always interested in what you would call the paranormal, the supernatural. So that's always been one of my private interests, despite the fact that I did a very practical job. Mm-hmm. When I got married, I no longer worked in the medical field, and I eventually was invited to learn counselling at a medical practice in England. And then it was interesting because some of the experiences there where people would talk to me and say, I talked to my dad, he died 2 years ago, but he tells me things and what have you. And I found this very intriguing because often it was very helpful. They'd say Dad would help me and comfort me and all this kind of thing. So it was plainly obvious to me what I'd been reading about over the years about life after death, spirit world and all of that actually had a tangibility. And I was quite comfortable with that, but I'd never had any personal, if you like, reason to necessarily qualify that until later on in my life. I migrated to Australia in 1991 to Perth, and it was there that I got interested and carried on with my counselling, working with people with grief and bereavement, severe grief, hospice. And again, the question came up, is there such a thing as a spirit world? Where do we go after death? So I'm still interested in the soul journey, for want of a better word. Mm-hmm. And I'd hear some extraordinary stories of people saying, my mum died a few years ago, but told me there was something special about that, something they'd hidden for me and telling me where it is. So very concrete stories in that sense. Again, that continued to gather, if you like, gain my curiosity or my focus in being curious. Read lots of books about reincarnation, life after death. Ultimately, I'm getting to the point where I got to the real weird and the wonderful in a minute. But the bottom line was that I saw that you could, through hypnosis, go into other lives and what have you, which proved reincarnation in terms of the way I saw it and read about it. So I learned hypnosis. And then it was quite interesting because people were going back into past lives. They were also going back into lives where they were not human, which was quite fascinating. Mm-hmm. And that in itself showed me there was a lot more to us as souls in terms of, so we don't just have human lives, we have lives where we come from other planets. But the reason I got into the particular area that I specialize in now, which is working with people that have contact with non-human intelligences, as well as, for some, the angelic realm or what I would call interdimensionals, was through a gentleman that came to me. He'd said to me, I've heard you're open-minded. For this, there's no support groups. For this, they just think you're a loony. Ellis Taylor. He lives in England now, a really good friend. And he said to me, nobody, people won't come to the house because because of these, what we're being visited by. And he said, he'd wake up with marks on his body, shaved areas. His partner was having experiences. The children were having experiences. So this wasn't one person having a fantasy or hallucinations. This was affecting the whole family quite seriously.
When the United States and China clash, the world will never be the same, especially when forces beyond reality threaten to intervene. What if the United States went to war with the People's Republic of China? How would these rivals fight for supremacy on land, sea, air, and across the stochastic streams of time? What wonder weapons would be unleashed? What horrors would emerge from the irradiated sludge of the South China Sea? What heroes would rise and forever change the course of history? Tread into the deepest and darkest dimensions of the multiverse, gaze through a kaleidoscope of fractured realities, and bear witness to the disturbing visions of World War III from today's greatest minds in science fiction, fantasy, and horror. Weird World War, China. Available now from Baen Books at baen.com.
And that led me down the rabbit hole, because what I discovered was that not only was he having experiences with different intelligences, and I thought it was very rare, until 2 weeks later somebody else walks through the door and they're having experiences. Unfortunately, and we were talking about synchronicities just prior to the interview, Sean, I'd read 2 books. One of them was Communion by Whitley Strieber, talking about experiences. And the other one was by Professor John Mack, the former professor of psychiatry at Harvard University, Abduction, Human Encounters with Aliens. So I had been kind of prepped, I call it, so that when I started to have these individuals come, which I thought was extremely rare, and I was blown away by it, I found out actually it's not extremely rare at all. And I've worked with about 3,500 families globally that have experiences, because it's often a family affair. It isn't just one person in the family. It's often grandparents as well as parents, as grandchildren, the whole gamut of that. And what I found was, more than anything, is the complexity of contact, because it's not just physical beings that we're talking about. We're talking about interdimensionals, extra-dimensionals, trans-dimensionals, and very likely beings from our future as well. So this is a very complex phenomena.
Can you define each of those? So like the difference between interdimensionals, extra-dimensionals, trans-dimensionals, etc.? Sorry.
Look, what I'm really saying is we know about dimensions, but apparently there are frequencies that are not part of dimensions. So we're talking about intelligences that are beyond dimensions, in a frequency that isn't qualified as a dimension. And we're told there's maybe as many as 13 dimensions. There are other information coming out that's saying there's more than 13, there's multiple of 13 and what have you. We don't even fully understand what the quantum universe is really telling us in terms of what our reality is. Transdimensional seems to be beings that go across dimensions as well. Mm-hmm. There are some that, when we talk about what I would call beyond the dimensions, is beings that are often called ascended masters, that know, again, it seems to be all about frequency. So some are called dimensions, some are beyond that. Some seem to be able to manipulate time and space, those from the future. And I had a 7-year-old tell me he's from the future, that he's come back to this present time. And he was talking about the beings having an IQ of over 400, that they were that intelligent, for example. It's quite fascinating, some of the information.
It's not hard to see from current trends that happening, right? You have CRISPR technology, you have... Yeah. Anyway, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. This is fascinating.
It's just that what I'm really trying to convey more than anything is not all intelligence is physical. And when someone says they're like a clairvoyant, or a medium says they're dealing with spirits and what have you, in that bucket will also be what we would call non-human intelligences, such as light beings, energy beings, humanoid beings, a whole range of those, and mantis type beings, reptilian type beings, bird-like beings. There's a whole gamut of different types of intelligence. Some of them are physical, some of them are energetic and traverse dimensions. But for simplicity's sake, when someone is having an interaction, it may be with one of those non-physical beings, but there are many, many physical ones as well.
To advertise on Through a Glass Darkly, email throughaglassdarkly@gmail.com. Now, when you talk about dimensions, do you mean spatial dimensions? Do you mean temporal dimensions? Do you mean dimensions outside of space and time? How's that defined?
Probably all of that, and I'm no physicist. Mm-hmm. The way that because it's not my area of expertise, the way I understand it is dimensions are different frequencies. So each dimension has a different frequency, but then you can bring in parallel universes, for example, because I've had individuals believe they've got an aspect of themselves in a parallel universe leading a different kind of life, making different decisions. So we can get into where does it stop and how do we understand it? There are those that have said to me they travel timelines, different timelines. Where does that take you? I mean, it's, quantum physics seems to be struggling on one level to be able to quantify this with string theory or whatever. But ultimately, for the average of us, because I'm a simple soul, I just see it as different intelligences operating in different frequencies, just in the same way that our eyes will only see a certain frequency band, but there are many, many other frequencies. And I believe they may be related to different dimensions in terms of how we understand reality.
So you could say, very oversimplified, a dimension is like a channel on a radio.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And each radio station is literally a frequency, right? So you just switch to a channel. Sometimes you might get some bleed over because of the waveform. It's okay. And then even with parallel universes, quantum mechanics would be, I think, I'll get his name wrong. I think it's like Hugh Everett. There's like a many worlds interpretation, which is basically a quark or some subatomic particle, whatever, has a probability distribution, right, on where it's going to be at any time. So if you imagine that everything takes every possible path is encapsulated in that probability distribution. So each possible path would be these timelines that you're talking about that are just, you do that, except you extrapolate it all the way up the chain from molecule to DNA to us, right? And you probably have, quadrillion different permutations and combinations or whatever. I'm just making up numbers here, but that's, I think, how quantum mechanics might describe it.
Well, you've done a very good job. I keep it really simple because it's not the way my brain works. But the bottom line is, I think what it's actually saying when you hear all these different accounts, and they're credible people, there are people that aren't seeking fame and fortune, are very reluctant even to share what they're experiencing. And yet they'll say, I know you're going to think I'm crazy, but I feel like I'm operating, I go out of body and I operate in this way and I'm doing this, this, and this. How can I decry that? How can I disqualify that just because I have no understanding of it? And that's my ultimate, is that that's somebody's reality, and that is having an effect on them because of how they understand their reality. And it just takes you into the multiverse, and it takes in, and the one thing I want to say is what we discovered through our surveys that with the Dr. Edgar Free Foundation was with 4,200 people, and the survey actually said that 75% of their encounters were out of body, not physical. And that's a huge number. So it's even harder to quantify that in three-dimensional terms because they can't bring a piece of the craft back to prove, well, I've been there. But they will have experiences where they can remember in detail being on a craft and doing certain tasks on a craft or learning things on a craft. And I always remember this 8-year-old who came to my office saying that when he's on the spaceship, there are children like himself, children he recognizes from his own school, and other children that didn't look quite human. And I said, what do you mean? He said, well, their eyes were different. And he said, and we were taught complex things, to use our mind and how to manipulate things. And I said, can you tell me some of the complicated things you're taught? And he said, no, because it's too complex for you. So basically, I wouldn't get it. Now, this is an 8-year-old explaining this to me. And this is what I mean is, what do you say to that?
Mm-hmm. It's not like, I mean, that's pretty fanciful for an 8-year-old, right? That's kind of beyond something that a typical 8-year-old might make up, right? Okay. All right. Going back to your background, I didn't mean to take us on a on a lark, but okay. So you start interviewing or helping these patients, and then what?
Well, what I thought was rare, I've now discovered is not rare at all. And there's huge numbers, I believe, that are having experiences like this globally. They are interpreted by different cultures in different ways through religious beliefs, scientific beliefs, educational beliefs. So, for one person who's very religious, they may say, I'm seeing an angel. For someone else who's not religious, they'll say, I'm seeing a light being or an energy being or whatever. Often it's the same. But what I was going to say was the way people interact with the beings may actually start with a particular experience they may have. For many that first came to me, it was through sighting of a UFO or waking up, feeling they're being taken somewhere, or having dreams of being on a UFO or whatever and seeing beings or whatever. But what I found also is this, people who've had near-death experiences start to have interactions with it. They may have had a shamanic experience or a Kundalini awakening or had energy healing that's activated more of their senses, their multidimensional senses. So it isn't just those that have, a UFO sighting that may, or missing time. It actually covers a lot of the multidimensional experiences. Remote viewing, another one. What we're doing is, once we access the multiverse or the multidimensional side of ourselves, then we start to realize all these different frequencies of beings and intelligences that are around us, and some of them are connected to us. And, you can call them your guardian angel, you can call them your guides or gatekeeper, you can call them Auntie May or Uncle Fred or whatever it is. But they're beings of intelligence that are connected to us in some way and wish to often support and help us in many cases, or help us to understand more of ourselves through those intuition. We'll get this feeling or knowing about something which makes sense, and we wonder where it's come from. We often, when I was counseling, I remember sometimes coming out with something without thought, and I'm thinking, oh, that's pretty okay. I didn't know I was so wise. I've learned since then that I'm often helped from a multidimensional level. So they're all around us, and we are seeing evidence of that in, now we have got digital photographs that actually show that there are these beings around us, and you're seeing forms and energies and orbs and all sorts of things, which are, to me, a wonderful proof that we're not alone, more than anything.
Now, the experiencers that come in and talk to you, are all these experiences universally positive, or are there also is there a negative side to this? And I don't want to dwell on it, but I just want to see if it's kind of all love and light, or if there's some balance, or if it's all dark.
I think it's an important one because there's a lot of fear out there. And of course, it's, from the mainstream side of things, everything's dark and they're all out to get us, which I think is the agenda. What was profound with the research that we did with the 4,000 individuals and the 600 questions was we found that 85% had a psycho-spiritual transformation in a positive way. In other words, even though they may have been frightened to begin with, once they understood more of what was going on, that shifted their awareness and they become a lot more loving, a lot more connected to nature, change of philosophy, change of the way that they viewed the world in a more connected way. So very, very positive, but there was 15% still very fearful and believing they're all evil. The bottom line is, for me, it seems to be mostly benevolent, but there does seem to be some self-serving species, and that I think is not particularly surprising. But what I will add there is some of those that are operating with fear because of their human interactions and abductions, we call MyLab, the military abductions. that have traumatized them. And I found the most traumatized that I've worked with were due to the military abductions where they've been drugged and interrogated. And that's all to find out what's going on the board of the craft. They are abducted by the military who have the technology, and they are, if you like, interrogated. They seem to be the most fearful of all. So there does seem to be a mix of both the military, human abductions, and some self-serving species. But on the whole, it seems to be, as I say, 85% believe that they had a transformation, a positive transformation, which I think, gives us a pretty good idea of agendas.
Mm-hmm. And is there certain types of people that come, like, is there any common criteria? I'm just going to throw things out. Many of these might just be false or whatever, but you hear people talk about blood types, you hear people talk about family lines. Like, are there any common characteristics about people that come in?
There are very common patterns, which I explore in my questionnaire. But certainly Rh negative seems to be a high preponderance of those with Rh negative seem to be that come up quite a lot. Certainly there seems to be genetic lines where if the grandfather or the father's having experiences, then it's quite likely so will the children. In terms of broadly, doesn't matter what religion, culture, part of the world, color, belief system, none of that, or age, social status, nothing seems to make any common pattern. You're either someone that these intelligences are interested in or you're not. And it does go through family lines. Rh negative seems to be quite a high percentage of those with Rh negative. But apart from that, it's more about people feeling different and feeling like they don't belong here and often say, this isn't my home planet. I've had to come to the conclusion without any doubt that we're talking about more than just our Earth incarnation, that we have come from other realities as souls, and that we've had incarnations, all of us, I believe, on other planets, in other dimensions. I remember a 10-year-old telling me that he came through a portal in the sun from another dimension. I've had children tell me they've come from other dimensions. I've had children explain to me they're hybrids, that they relate to a planet. I remember a 10-year-old telling me in the other planet he was blue. This is his first incarnation. He picked a mum that had many incarnations here to help him adjust to being human. And he called himself a center seed, and he's here to help with pollution. He has all these different abilities and whatever. I had another 8-year-old explain that she's a water being from another planet. When she looks in the mirror, she's seeing her water being self. So she's part human, part water being. But the interesting ability she had, Sean, was that she said when she hears music, she actually goes with the frequency of the music to the person who's actually created it and the emotions and feelings that belong to the individual that's created. So in other words, she has a kind of incredibly in-depth connection to the frequency of music in itself. So somehow or other, she brought in that ability. And this is what I'm finding with the new generations of human. They have some extraordinary abilities from a multidimensional level.
Now, are there people who kind of latently wake up, like they have no memory of any of this stuff, and then suddenly they do? Is that a common thing, or is that, and how does that look?
It certainly is. And again, I look at it like the soul chooses when it's ready for that soul to wake up. And for some, it's right from birth. There are others that shut it down for a while because it doesn't serve them, because they find it too hard to be in this world and be still tapped into that awareness. But there are many that have said, I just had the odd thing when I was a kid where I thought I had something around me and it was very scary and I didn't quite know what to make it. And I used to hear these weird footsteps or something like that. Don't know if it means anything. Or they've had a missing time episode years and years and years ago. I never really looked into it until they get to a point in their lives, and they could be 50, they could be 60. I've had 80-year-olds that have said to me, this thing happened when I was 15. I've always wondered about it. So there might be a particular incident that's always bothered them. and then going back into it, realizing that they've had interactions actually all their life, but they've not been conscious of it. But there's some little trigger that says you've got to find out now. And talking about that, that's been very common in recent years, where people in 2012, after that date, many people started to want to and explore these experiences. And very recently has been another time when more and more people have said, you know what, I've just got to find out what that dream meant. Because, we're often likely to say, well, that's a dream. I dreamt I was on a spaceship, or I dreamt that I was doing this on another planet, or whatever. And I say to them, the difference between a dream that's you just working things out and processing is you wake up and within minutes and seconds, you've forgotten it. If you've remembered that dream for 10 or 15 or 20 years, mate, it's most likely not a dream. It's actually something that you've remembered as an experience. Because we're very good at disqualifying things because they don't fit in with what we think should be reality.
It's funny you mentioned that. I'm just going to tell you a quick story, because this is a dream that didn't make any sense, but it was a nightmare for me as a kid. But when I tell you the facts, it's not. There's nothing scary about it at all. They're just very, very strange fact pattern. Okay, so I was between 5 and 7, maybe, but I would wake up in the middle of the night. This is the dream. And I would walk into my sister's bedroom, and it would open up into the backyard, and it would be daytime, and there was always like a crone, like an old short woman, 4 or 5 feet tall, just hanging clothing on a clothesline. And I would wake up and I would be terrified. That doesn't make any sense, but I remember the dream because it would be recurring. So I have no idea how to interpret it, but that's the one dream I remember from childhood.
Well, that's an interesting one because it was recurring, and her height was quite interesting as well, because I would call that a screen. That's often a screen
Maybe.
for something else. Sometimes the screen can be someone who's fearful of clowns, Santa Claus, skeletons, and whatever. They're all screens for the greys, for example. So the only way that you could explore that is to go into your subconscious and ask for a rewind. Because the interesting thing with the subconscious, it records things as is. It doesn't edit at all. It just literally records. So one of the things I'd like to say to people who are a little bit ambivalent about trusting hypnosis, Dr. John Mack, after all, he was a Harvard professor of psychiatry, said that actually subconscious hypnotic information is far more accurate than conscious recall. Why is that? Because conscious recall edits. Whereas subconscious does not edit. It is as it is. And I absolutely concur with that. And that's what I have found, even though it's extraordinary, some of the information that comes out. If you get it without editing, and often you see what I would be doing with that is saying, I want you to look more closely at the crone in your subconscious. And then you will, see what it really is. And for some, it's like I'm seeing a clown. And I'll say to them, I want you to look again. And they'll say, oh, it's not a clown. It's right.
And when you ask them this question, you just ask them to sleep on it, or in hypnosis, hypnotherapy, or like, how would you have somebody do that?
Well, if I'm taking them into their subconscious and they're reliving something, because I'll take them into looking at where they are, describing where they are, asking them what's happening next. If, for example, and I'll give you an example of a regression I did with a young man who had, and the story is quite interesting because he'd had an accident on his motorbike when he was a young man. He fell off and he'd had a concussion. He got back home and had no memory of how he had the accident and whatever. And to cut a long story short, I got him to go back to seeing if he could recover the memory because he'd had concussion. And he went along a country road and he still hadn't fallen off his bike, carried on going in the country road. And all of a sudden I'm saying, what's in front of you? And he's saying, spaceship. And this is completely out of the blue. I'm thinking, oh, okay, right. What's happening next? And then there's a lot more to the story. Remember, this was something we were exploring, what happened to why he had a concussion.
Right. It just came out of the blue. Right.
This came completely out of the blue. This was no front loading, nothing. he's being taken up on the spacecraft, and he's saying, what do you see? And he said, I'm seeing clown's shoes. Well, I already knew about the clown screen memory. So I just said, I want you to look again. And he's saying, it's a being, and it's grey. And he describes the typical grey being. So I knew then he'd had certain procedures on board the craft. The accident actually happened when he'd been put down again and returned to his motorbike. And because probably he was still a little bit kind of floaty and whatever, he says, I didn't see an obstacle in front of me, and I went straight over on my bike and bashed my bike up and had the concussion. And of course, then was in hospital for 2 days because of the concussion. No memory of the UFO experience whatsoever. But we discovered later that he'd had experiences all through his life, all up to that point and beyond that point. But it was the accident that he wanted to explore that highlighted he'd had this experience, for example. So that, talk about coming out of the blue. It was like, and this is what I want to say to people. They don't come to me with fantasies. Many of them come a long distance because they want to know something that was anomalous in their lives or whatever. But people have come to me with different issues, completely different issues, and then found out in hypnosis that they've had some form of ET encounter that they had no memory of and up to the hypnosis, and very hard to assimilate when you're exploring something completely different and this comes up. But this has happened numerous times.
Okay. All right. Well, so this experience in particular that I just told you about, is that worth pursuing, or are there other things that I should look for before taking that any further? Because sometimes a dream's just a dream, right? And I'm not saying that to push back or be skeptical. I'm just trying to be balanced about these sorts of things.
Well, one thing I do send to everybody is a questionnaire. And it's not your standard questionnaire, because it's not just taken about what you've cited outside and how long you cited it and how big it was and how many people were there and the standard kind of question. It's talking about other parts of you that have awareness, like feelings and knowings, things that, where you've always felt maybe different, felt like you've been adopted. These kind of things are classic patterns to somebody that's had some form of interaction. Your abilities, do you sense energy, this kind of thing. So it's covering a whole range of things that gives me, as well as the individual, different things that connect to the possibility that this might be relevant to you or whatever. And I will look at them, and I can look at very quickly and see certain things and think, well, without doubt, they've had stuff go on. Now, where do you want to take it? Do you want to explore something? But to give you an example, somebody may only have a memory of a missing time episode as the only indicator that they've had something happen. No memory of anything else. Often, actually, many people don't have good memories of the childhood, which is another indicator. They say, I don't remember much of my childhood. That's an indicator that you may have had stuff happen. But when I have got somebody on a craft and they're looking around, they're telling me they're seeing one or two beings, one of the questions that I will ask is that when you look at the beings, is there any of them that look familiar to you? And they'll go, yes, this one to my right, which is interesting, because if they're familiar, it means they've seen them before. Okay, and that's the intent behind it. I want you to ask the being how many times they've picked you up. And they'll reel off 2, 5, 7, 20, whatever it is. They'll just reel it off because they connect to it and they can bring in the information. And that can blow them away because they have no memory or no recall up to that moment that their subconscious is actually giving them the information.
Do you ever ask them to ask why they've been picked up? And
absolutely, because
what answers do you get? I'm very fascinated by this.
Of course, because what you do before they have the hypnosis, I'd say, I want you to write down all the questions that you've got that you want answered, so that when I've got them in that space, that quantum space, they can talk to the beings. And all I'll do then is, why have you picked me up this time? And they'll say, oh, it's a medical exam, or it's healing, or they're just checking things out, or they've moving conscious. So they'll get the information why they're being picked up. Okay, what's my connection to you? And that can be scary because they'll find, some of them at least, that there's been an input from one of these intelligences into their DNA for certain qualities or abilities or whatever. So whatever they're asking on that piece of paper that they give me, I'm going to ask those questions, including, have you consented on any level? And the fascinating answer to that is yes, but before I came here. In other words, as a soul. So this takes it into a whole new level of understanding the nature of soul and the spiritual journey. Any question they ask, I will then get them to ask in that space, because in that quantum space, they will get the answers. And then, is there any of the other beings want to say anything to you? Because you can do that when they're in that space. And they'll say, yes, this one at the back, the tall one that looks human. Right, what's their connection to you? So, all the questions they've probably been asking all their lives can be answered through that process. And not all hypnotherapists do this, by the way. This is something I developed and realized worked out really, really well. And so I've used it from that time because it does work. And it gives them, and they can choose after the hypnosis to discount all of it if they want to. And they say, that's too crazy for me, too weird. I remember one lady who went somnambulistic, which means completely unconscious. So she wasn't aware of anything she said. And she's talking to a mantis being with the clicking sounds. And she's click, 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 and she's actually having a conversation with this mantis on board craft. And when she came out of it, she said, well, what happened? And I told her, and she couldn't believe it. She said, I don't believe that. That's too crazy. I can't. I said, well, you had a conversation. I gave her the recording. I said, you can make of it what you will. But she actually communicated with the same clicking tongue that the mantis was, and having a dialogue. So you can make of that what you will. But
I mean, was she still speaking in English, or was she like just with the click?
After it went back to English, but the actual clicking and the response to whatever she was hearing from the mantis being was spoken with them both speaking the clicking sounds. And I've had clicking in my record. I've had so many weird things happen in my recordings.
Have you ever had a linguist take a look at that?
No, I haven't. The clicking is one thing. What's interesting is there's bush people in South Africa, the Bushmen, that click.
Yeah, there's 100%. Very, very few humans do that, but there's some tribes in Africa that still speak with that. Yeah.
Yeah, but there's also many that speak the different light languages and having conversations in the light language. And I've got a recording. I've had lots and lots of recordings, but one is a 7-year-old that calls herself a hybrid. And she says she's part blue avian, part human. She's a healer. And she explained a mother recorded her speaking light language to somebody else over the phone, was also had experiences. And they were talking to each other in the light language and understanding each other in the light language. So it gets even more bizarre on one level. But this is happening to a lot of people that are waking up to their, what we would call their star heritage, for want of a better word, their connection to other star systems, whether it's Pleiadian, Arcturus, Andromeda, Orion. And they will bring down the frequency or the language from that particular star system. And some can actually dialogue with one another with it. Although some of the language, I believe, the symbols or some of the information is like a software program on multidimensional in nature, which can't be translated, which is like kind of software that needs to be unpacked to be understood. So it's got multiple purposes and what have you. This is the stuff that I've got into. I mean, never in a million light years would I have thought that I would look at this and find this out and explore it, because it's just that it's happening to so many people now. They can't all be losing the plot, as I call it. They can't, because it's too common. And you've got children coming out with it. You've got 90-year-olds coming out with it. So what is actually going on? What is really happening?
Seriously, what is actually happening? Why is this all happening all at once?
Well, I've got theories. I'm very good at theories. So hold on, I'll just get a tissue. Yeah. My theory is this, Sean, and you can make of it what you will. You can think Mary's lost the plot. I don't really care. It's up to people. The way that I've looked at it, trying to understand it from a broader perspective, we do know, and it seems to be coming out more and more accepted, Francis Crick, all those years ago, talked about the fact that we were intelligently designed. there are many, many of those now coming out with the understanding that we have been manipulated by a number of these different systems, star systems, if you like. Some say 12, some say as many as 22, have added their DNA to the indigenous Homo sapiens to create Homo sapiens sapiens with twice the brain size and 223 genes that do not belong to the original indigenous Homo sapiens. So we know that that's and I believe absolutely that that's just the tip of the iceberg. But to start with, if we take that on as a hypothesis, what we've seen is that we've been visited over the eons by different gods, which I believe were actually different beings from different star systems with technology that have been deified. Mm-hmm. I'm simplifying this. But what's interesting is about the DNA. We're told that the scientists the geneticists only really understand that about 5 to 10% of our DNA is activated. They don't know what the rest of the DNA does. They've called it dormant DNA, all sorts of junk DNA and whatever. My understanding is from my research is a lot of that DNA is now being activated. And that's why you've got people that are starting to say, I feel I'm from the Pleiades, or I feel I'm from Arcturus or Sirius or whatever. I think they're connecting to that ET DNA that's there, that's being activated at the moment. And what is also important here is as that's getting activated, their abilities are being magnified. We talked about multidimensional abilities, that people are starting to sense things more. They're becoming more intuitive, more aware. They are seeing spirits. They're seeing and feeling and getting information from a higher source. All this kind of abilities from remote viewing, astral traveling, all these different things that we're activating in ourselves as a consciousness. If that continues, what do we need to manage that as we become more multidimensional? We need the new software for the new upgraded biological system. And I believe some of these downloads are the software for the new human the greater, what it's called, the new human. Need the software so we can manage it, so that we know how to manage it. And I give the analogy of the film Lucy, and I don't know how many people that will have seen the movie. It's about
It's the one with Scarlett Johansson, right?
Yeah. The important point in that is as her DNA gets more and more activated, she becomes more and more multidimensional until she ultimately ends up as light. Well, you need an operating system to help you manage that, don't you? And I believe these downloads that are happening to countless people, adults, children, are bringing in codes, strange scripts, strange languages and whatever. I believe some of those are the new software for the new upgrade human. I have no idea whether I'm right, but we will need a new operating system because with us, look at those that have a Kundalini awakening that don't manage it very well. Why? Because they're trying to go from a very limited understanding of reality to a multidimensional one overnight. How do you do that? It's mind-blowing, literally, and many end up in hospital not managing it at all. So if they're going to activate humanity's consciousness, we are going to need the aids to do that. And I believe some of it that's being downloaded that people are getting, not fully understanding it, but it may very well be the software that we need to help us manage the new human, activated human, if you like, where we become multidimensional. And part of what I think will be that, they're preparing us to become part of the galactic community. That's my sense. I've no idea if I'm right, but at the moment, that's where I've joined the dots, and it could be all wrong. I don't know. But it makes sense to me, at least, that this is part of the program. They've got to have a program to help us if we're going to be upgraded in our consciousness, to be able to embody all this new information.
Now, with all this, who's in charge?
Well, I think we are, from a very high perspective. I've often wondered, and there's two things I can tell you, and I have no idea again whether I'm hitting the Star Trek and the holodeck. Are we there saying, yeah, I'm going to go back to the 19 what's-its and see what it's like living there? So we're creating our own reality. But there's one thing I share very rarely, but I will admit to this. I was only about 3.5 years old, and I'm looking outside, and my mum's having a siesta, and it's really deadly quiet in the afternoon. You know how the afternoons can be really still, and nothing moves. And my mum was having her daily siesta, and this thought came to me. Remember, I was 3.5 at the time. I wonder if things only move when I look at them. Now I was 3.5. Where did that come from? I have no idea. I still don't know where it came from. But it's not something a 3.5-year-old normally thinks.
Right. Like if, a tree falls in the woods and nobody's there to observe it.
That's exactly right. So where did that come from, and what was it telling me? And I've often wondered what I'm supposed to extrapolate from that in terms of our reality.
Okay, I think that's a good moment to end the interview, and then we'll expand on this in the next. So thank you very much, Mary. It was an absolute pleasure.
Thank you, Sean.
If you enjoyed today's video, please hit like and subscribe, and also hit the notification button so you can be notified whenever I post new content. Thank you. Now, if you're enjoying the channel and you want to support it, there are several things you can do. In fact, there are 5 things you can do. The first thing you can do is just buy my books. I got plenty of books out in the market right now, and I would prefer that folks buy a book rather than giving me direct support, because they get something out of it. They get a real tangible product. The second way you can support me is by becoming a member on YouTube or becoming a patron on Patreon. And just go to either site and it'll explain everything. The third way you can support the channel is by checking out my merch site, which is here. There's plenty of stuff that you can get to support the channel. And I'd appreciate that you have it and can wear it. Not only do you help support the channel, but you also help promote the channel, and I appreciate that. The fourth way that you can support the channel, and this is really easy, is anytime you want to buy something on Amazon, literally just go to the description below and click on any link, literally any link. The channel gets a cut of that, and it costs you no extra money. You just go through the link, as I'm part of the Amazon Affiliates Club. The fifth and final way you can support the channel is through donations. Now, I don't prefer these because it's more of an expression of gratitude, but you don't really get anything out of it as a subscriber to the channel. However, if you decide to do these options, there's 2 options. There's Buy Me a Coffee, which is a separate site, and there's also, you can go through YouTube with either a super chat, super sticker, or a super thanks. Again, I prefer Buy Me a Coffee because that organization takes less money than Amazon does. But either way, I appreciate any support you are willing to give the channel. So thank you very much, and keep watching. I really appreciate it.